welcome everyone to this webinar, this Crip Talk. And my name is Lloyd Coleman, and I'm the Associate Music Director of Power Orchestra. I am a hearing impaired and visually impaired clarinetist and composer. I was born in South Wales and went to Cheetham School of Music in Manchester. I mention that because if you're wondering why I don't have a particularly Welsh accent, that in part explains why I've lost a bit of my South Walian twang, my years spent in Manchester and later London. I'm now based here in Bristol, just across the border. I'm acutely aware that those of you in Wales at the moment are in the midst of a firebreaker lockdown, and of course England is about to go into a lockdown. I hope you're all staying safe and well in these very difficult times for many of us. A few words on the format of the session. We have three brilliant speakers from across the music industry today to talk about their experiences of the cultural barriers, some of the physical barriers, and indeed some of the structural barriers that exist in the music industry, and perhaps to talk about their own experiences of how they've either circumnavigated those barriers or overcome them, and just to talk in general about their practice and their experiences of working in the professional music industry. I'll be hosting the session. We'll have 10 minutes from each speaker, roughly, an informal presentation. We'll then take 5 to 10 minutes break in the middle of the session so we can rest our eyes and our ears and reflect on what we've heard so far. And as Rachel said already, we want to have your questions and your experiences in the second part of the session, and it will be my job to field some of those questions and to put those to our panelists. So without further ado, that's enough from me. Let's kick off, shall we, with Gareth, who is a composer. Gareth, I know pretty well already. We've worked together at Power Orchestra on a project that we hope will see the light of day sometime soon. It was supposed to be quite recently, wasn't it? But sadly, due to one thing and another and COVID and all the rest of it, the project was postponed. But Gareth is a brilliantly imaginative composer and music creator living in Cardiff, but I think in Somerset today, an academic, and he has a record on the T-Care music label, which I can definitely recommend as well. So Gareth, it's over to you, sir. I'll put you on the timer.
Just as well, I've got a bit of a reputation for rambling in the university. Jochen Bauer-Lloyd, found today's geology kills it enough from his Cymru. He's Dighead, and from Wahadi Shad. Good afternoon. I'd like to start by saying thank you to Disability Arts Cymru, She Cares, for inviting me to speak today, and with some apologies to lip readers and the captioner for opening in the Welsh language. I hope that wasn't too confusing, so I'll do my best to speak English from now on. Thanks to Lloyd for that warm welcome. Yes, as I said, I'm a composer. I'm a stroke survivor, so I live with physical, sensory, and cognitive impairments, but sort of muddle through as best I can, I suppose. So I thought about this talk with mainly with reference to personal experience. I should mention my background is as a professional oboist. I play the oboe professionally. I'm working in London orchestras. I mean, only as a deaf. I was never really in a London orchestra, but I played with a few of them for odd gigs and odd days here and there, filling in, as it were. So a lot of my experience in the workplace of musicians has been in theatres, in concert halls, in the opera house, and this sort of structural environment. But I thought I'd like to start by talking about some cultural issues. It seems to me actually, I think the establishment is one of the biggest cultural issues. You know, the orchestra in particular and other obvious chamber ensembles have got several hundred years of tradition behind them. And these are things that have been said, but it's extremely difficult to break into. As you know, I've worked in probably half a dozen
Gareth, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you mid-flow. Your mic quality or your sound quality is just deteriorating slightly. Have you got anything over your microphone there? Or
Sorry, is that better? I think I might put my notes on it. Maybe I'm too far away as well.
That would be great. If you could move a little bit closer. It's a little bit Dalek-y at the moment, but hopefully that will improve over time.
Yeah, apologies. Is this any better?
A little better. Joe and Mark, is that better for you? Are you the plug-in mic?
You need to start talking again, and where was I?
Thank you, Gareth.
I'm saying the orchestra seems very much to be a kind of established thing, which as a disabled musician is a near impossible thing to break into. And thankfully, in contemporary society, there are one or two institutions like the wonderful Power Orchestra, which Lloyd has mentioned, which I imagine may get mentioned a little more as we go on today. And the Opera Company's Formidability, the Resound Project, the Bournemouth Symphony. There's several wonderful groups made up of disabled performers, professional disabled before they should mention these days. But the orchestra still is a bit of an issue, I think, and that's part of the establishment. I think that's one of the biggest cultural issues. Speaking as a classical musician and a disabled musician professionally, I think the other big issue in society for me is a concern concerning misconception, and perhaps when people's appearance maybe suggest to some people that one can't play the cor anglais or whatever it is because one uses a wheelchair or something. But I know some very good musicians who use chairs and play as well as I ever did, but to not have full-time jobs in the kind of core full-time orchestras, which I think is a great shame. You know, as somebody who moves around, as I said, with physical and sensory disabilities, you know, the way I navigate public spaces, especially unfamiliar public spaces, is abnormal. I'm dependent on rails. I move slowly. I've got a fairly pronounced head turn anyway, but, you know, I have to get quite close to a wall to see it if I'm not going to hit it. And, you know, this leads, in my experience, venues, particularly hospitality, box office and front of house staff, are, it seems to be, not terribly well versed in dealing with disabled people, you know, and I think questions as to whether I'm perhaps under the influence of some sort of substance abuse because I hit everything rather than because I just can't see it's there, which is embarrassing and a little bit demoralizing, has to be said. So this, in a way, I think links me to structural problems. Excuse me a moment while I refer to my notes. Yes, structural problems, as I said, there's an issue seems to be with the provision of disabled facilities in art venues. They are kind of delivered in broad strokes with a very much a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, but no two people's behaviour or brains are the same. So the idea that any two chair users have the same access needs is a little bit inappropriate. Speaking as somebody who's lived in an electric wheelchair and in a push-along wheelchair with a carer and now mobilises, albeit slightly clumsily, independently, you know, these things all have very different needs.
Gareth.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you again. You haven't had your full 10 minutes, but what I'm going to suggest, the mic quality is still a little bit crackly my end. So I'm going to suggest we move on to Joe, and maybe we can sort out your sound in the meantime and come back to you before the break. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'll see what I can do while I'm paying attention.
Thanks very much, Gareth. And from the contribution you've made so far, there's lots of interesting things to pick up on there from lots of different angles. So, you know, as an audience member, as a professional musician, I'd be interested to hear more later as well about your experiences within academia as well, and maybe how the conceptions are different or not. But in the meantime, while you sort out your mic, Joe, would you like to pick up?
Okay, so yeah, so I've just written a small little talk. So my paper, or little paper, my paper is called Gate Crashing the Party. And so I'll start. So my name is Jo Thomas. I work as a composer. I write in a subculture of electronic music glitch music. I'm a woman, a disabled musician. I'm bisexual. I have epilepsy and I'm mobility impaired. I think as a person in the world, I belong to many different cultures. I have worked in electronic sound for most of my life. I have won international competitions with my music, and I'm aware of my achievements in music. My music works the ideas of electronic, and I will now work with sound and sculptures and work with sound for civic spaces. You can find my music in museums, galleries, hospitals, universities, education websites, and now in future you'll be able to find it in the Encyclopedia of Electronic Sound. I'm an external examiner, and pre-COVID, I was contracted by the Arts Council of England to be an assessor of contemporary music. So I have been asked to talk about barriers in music. I find this really difficult because talking about barriers makes me very sad. I try to avoid barriers at all costs, either ignoring them or getting on with things. But in truth, I confront them. I confront them in meetings, when I'm traveling, when I'm performing, when I'm working. I do feel that there needs to be a degree of honesty within music and culture to generally acknowledge the type of barriers which disabled musicians are facing. I do not feel that disabled musicians have been acknowledged enough, both in recent discussions about music as well as historic discussions about music. It is changing and action is happening, but I do feel that there could be more visibility of disabled musicians in culture. Active disabled musicians speak to me about this in culture all the time. This event is a good step forward. It would be more fantastic to see more events like this in the future. Creating music has always occupied an extraordinary place in culture. We are the magicians, the purveyors of beauty, the creators of elemental art. Music is a product of the gifted, the blessed, the privileged, the inspirational. Creating music and identifying as a disabled person, admitting impairment, is something that still quite doesn't fit comfortably within the traditional music cultural narratives. To be able to admit impairment with the structures of music, systems need to be in place. Systems where people are able to speak freely without judgment and express their concerns and needs. I've worked in places where this has happened. I've had support from these systems. I've been able to talk to people honestly about what I can offer and give them. Problems that happen, when problems happen, is when people do not listen to disabled musicians' words, and the voices are ignored. From recent report by Youth Music, lack of empathy and compassion is something that comes through really strongly in music environments in the UK, with disabled musicians and consistent assumptions. And music communities all over the UK think the same way. People want to see change. I am a director at the Ivers Academy Group. In the Ivers Academy, we are working with the Musicians Union at this moment with accessibility riders and trying to work towards making the accessibility riders an industrial standard. Within my own electronic music, I work with glitch, I have repeatedly worked with glitch for around 20 years. My glitches are a reference to being human and not necessarily being disabled. I want to humanize my threads into I want to humanize my sound into threads of zeros and ones. I do not think of my music as disabled music, nor do I think of my performances as disabled performances. Is my music a performance of disability? I'm not sure, as my identification with disability has changed as culture has changed around it. I worked with colours, numbers, maps, and images as descriptors of sound and gestures. Digital technology has opened a whole new world for this environment of expression. I have written this way all my life. Some people find it different, strange, and difficult, and that can be a barrier. I have synesthesia, I am neurodiverse. I choose to work with multiple things to make music. I work with tactile scores, photographs, objects, and think of sound and think of those things as sounds themselves. On a project that I'm working on at the moment, I'm working with people in spaces and asking them to draw their sounds of the memories in that space, themselves in that space. And I am composing from those images. And that is very different for them to work with, but it's working. So when I'm talking about music and music industry, I'm using it in the broader sense. I'm speaking it as something that I'm speaking about it as something that we all own, each one of us. Music as something that we make, work with, listen to, visit music shops. We all have friends that are involved in music. We are all part of music. We are all part of it and in it together. Therefore, we are right to question why there's a lack of visibility, participation, engagement, when we find we have the right to. So, as an epileptic, should I say that? Kind of, that's how I have epilepsy. My epilepsy has been interesting in my career and working with it and around it, because I found that the things that have been barriers to me in epilepsy, with epilepsy, have been not having a meal before before I go on stage, or having enough money to buy a meal before I go on stage, and also having a quiet space before I go on stage. And it would be exactly the same if I was doing an online performance, because my epilepsy is triggered by stress. And so if I'm really, really stressed, I just need to have spaces where I can just be quiet, quiet spaces. And that could be thought of as the barrier as a disabled person. I see that actually as a barrier. But I've worked consistently all the way through culture, and I've either asked for a meal or we've worked around it. And I've kind of found a space to sit. And it's when I haven't done that, then that's when problems have happened. Over the last few years, I've worked with initiatives which have worked towards addressing barriers. Was a Pathways project, and that was in 2014 to 2016, and that was designed by Sound of Music. And the Pathways project was a project that worked on the intersections, actually, of culture. So Sound of Music discovered, and they kind of knew that actually the initiatives, the music initiatives that they were working with were not reaching out to disabled musicians, nor Black musicians, and I think nor LGBTQ musicians. And the Pathways Project acknowledged socioeconomic circumstances as that project. And one thing that really struck me actually from that project is the chance to actually register before music, before you actually decide to apply for a commission or an opportunity, because I don't think that that had ever been done before. Like and to talk the expectations and what was available and what they could help with, and it was a really personal project, and a lot of it was about talking. The second kind of like the second one that was really comes over strongly to me is the fair access one as well. And one thing that really struck me from that project was how many came across so strongly for me and other composers and artists. So I asked lots and lots of times to send stuff in, and but if it's with a fee, it becomes just impossible, because I'm a musician, I'm a disabled musician now, especially now with limited funds. So money is really coming through as a barrier to engagement and participation. And when disabled musicians are actually being asked to kind of like send in or participate with 50 people, no actual problem.
Joe, I'm sorry. We're not having a lot of luck with the internet connection today. Sorry for the glitches. We're having the wrong kinds of glitches today on our Zoom connection. Not the right connection. So, but I think if it's okay, if you've given a really nice summary, I think of.
Okay, so I think COVID has really changed the way we work, and barriers may have disappeared for some of us, but for a lot of musicians and for me as well in different ways, the barriers are going to be stronger in regards to digital poverty, because if you're not able to log in with a computer, you are not going to be able to participate with music, and that's a real problem. So it's it's really, really coming forward, and I've had to, a big barrier for me was actually I had to apply for funding for a computer. And it was really, really do that to be addressed. How do we create a music community without, which is actually not all stuck in the internet, but actually more so, more with people. How do we do it? Can we make more use of public broadcasting? So When I say gate crashing the party, I mean really, actually, I don't want to be invited in. I don't think I need to be invited in. I want to walk in with my head high. And I think that people should be able to do that. Disabled musicians should be able to do that now. I think we do that now. And I think that there should be more acknowledgement of disabled musicians in culture. So there we are. Thank you. That's it.
Fantastic, thank you, Joe. I'm sorry for gate crashing your talk in the middle there. There was a few buffering issues just in the middle, but I caught almost all of what you said and loads of really interesting prescient points, which I'm sure we'll come back to in the Q&A, if that's all right.
Okay. Yeah.
On to Mark.
Hi.
Up in Llandudno. I'm hoping the Wi-Fi is going to help us in Llandudno today. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself and your perspective on this topic in 10 minutes?
Yeah, I would. And thanks so much for hosting this discussion, Lloyd, and doing such a good job with the technology. And thanks very much, Joe, for those comments as well, and Gareth about the structural issues within music. So I'll pick up, if you don't mind, about that idea of the party and what is the party that we're trying to crash, and you know, what does it look like? And the report, there was a report in 2016 that interviewed 2,000 musicians. And it looked at their mental health, and the report's entitled, "Does Music Make You Sick?" So there's the extent to which you could be non-disabled going into working music, and then the extent to which, having struggled in music for 10 years, your latent disability, which could be cyclical, things go up and down along with the creative process, could be worse, significantly worse than it would be otherwise. And the figures on that report were so astonishingly bad that there was a second report made in 2017 that tried to make up some solutions, but it's quite difficult because we're in 2020 now. And the figure was 75% of all musicians interviewed had almost crippling and severe depression. So there's an extent to which music is disabled music. Music actually is a good home for people who don't feel comfortable in the normal economic party. So, when we're looking at barriers, as disabled people, we have a lot of structural barriers that are there with society. And then we have some additional ones that seem quite unnecessary and quite unproductive and easily avoidable within our chosen profession. And not only that, but the means of accessing the party or being accepted by the party practically involve fermenting a peculiarity perhaps, or a originality, because it is deemed that if music is completely done by script or score with no inspiration or no feeling or no vulnerability or none of the things that in normal life are frankly quite unhelpful, then the music could be considered somewhat slick. So with the COVID thing, what seems to have happened is there's very, very many negative societal pressures that have actually affected the non-disabled community quite significantly. And even where there's a sort of a minority within that majority, for example, the older generations who obviously need more shielding, more protection and things like this, the means by which society can adapt by instruction have been pretty rapidly deployed. And for certain people working within the music industry with more hidden, less obvious disabilities, of which depression and anxiety are fueling things like anti-inflammatory conditions, there's no doubt about that. They are sort of, they're quite dangerous things to be carrying for quite a long time. It's actually a little bit easier for the disabled person now to go about in society because people are keeping more distance, they're washing their hands more, which is really good if people have immune challenge. The lack of restaurants, obviously, as you've explained there, Joe, I mean, that is one of the things, isn't it? If you get a good gig, you get a rider and you end up with a sausage roll and a couple of cans of lager on it. Whereas, to get the functioning organism ready for a performance, you need nutrition, you need calm, and you need a decent dressing room. And what my research has led me to discover actually is that within the Arts Council, for example, in Wales now, we've got this wonderful Connect and Flourish initiative where younger people within the Arts Council are saying to the older heads within the Arts Council, who've been there a long time, to be fair, and a bit past their sell-by date, that we need to have more innovative cluster-based hubs to, run this instead of a competition. Instead of a Hunger Games with a deadline and you've got to get in quick. So what happens is we've got this aspiration at the moment whereby we're being asked to come in, connect, flourish. You look at what flourishing is, in a musical context, it basically just means trumpets. But it's speaking about some form of ornate, considered work and response to reality, whereas a lot of the thing is set up as a competition. Because, I don't think the Arts Council in Wales wants to be a benevolent society. So for the attendees here, and it's fantastic to see so many of you, I think the good news is, firstly, it is now acceptable to say that you have needs and they are such, and they are going to be your needs, and you're going to have to do some work, with the resources that are available to you that do exist to try and understand your own needs and peculiarities a bit more. Now, when you start interfacing within the professional music industry, it's actually a lot less professional than a lot of the parallel industries where innovative working and collaboration are not just simple purchase arrangements are involved. So for example, if you're truly collaborating, the definition of collaboration in the food business is that two arm's length companies are working together for some form of undetermined partnership in the future. And that's the default for collaboration in music. You go to these boring meetings and it's like publishing this and publishing that before you've come up with a tune, right? It's completely debilitating. So what they tend to do is they just say, well, look, if you're using somebody and you're working with someone, send me the invoice, the problem's solved, and you've got a purchase arrangement. And then for collaborations, well, those purchases, a few of those lead to friendships. And then with music, it's no good just having somebody paid by the hour. If you send somebody a track and you want them to work on it, if you want them to stick it on their Walkman and go to the park and get out there and, interact with their reality so that when they get down to doing something in the studio or the session, you're only paying for the tiny little bit you see for the time. So it's not really a time thing, You can do a great take in 10 minutes and yet you have to charge a day. So I think some of those structural things would be really useful to get tied down to and just know what a musician's work is, like what's a good rate. And for me, I think, £200 a day is reasonable. And then there's some musicians bring a lot of capital and things like this. That's a bit more, and some form of, more clearly defined boundaries on that. And the second thing is, I think when musicians, and I've had this as being both an artist with some difficulties that were unacknowledged or masked or whatever, or developing, and then maybe amplified by music, is that you don't want to use your manager, who's a professional service. I mean, it's good to have a manager. They can arbitrage, they can talk to people, they can help you with, things. You don't want to use them as the sort of access cost support, because that's not really what they do. So I think it's really good for musicians to be able to go, well, look, I am a musician, I identify as a musician, what help is there? And alongside with the income support and things like this, there is access to work support help. And actually, if you can get your stuff organized enough and go to that, there are amazing resources to get support workers specifically to allow you to work and be productive. So that's, I think that's really important. And then when we are dealing with the Arts Council and funders or recording companies and things like this, the main thing to do is to just make sure that they understand that what you're bringing to the table is creativity, and you're not bringing a linear, beige, gray approach to filling up a track. So, in the sort of, more popular music arts, what you tend to see is the more normative frontsman, or frontsperson, which is the dance band or something like that. And then the disabled musicians in the background doing the production, doing the keys, doing the stage support. Now, contrast what happens to visual artists with what happens to musical artists or theatrical artists. Like, musicians like to play in theaters. We like to play in rooms where there's not a bar. We like to play to a quiet environment. And yet when you try and pursue this ambition, they go, well, you've got to pay your dues. So you've got to go to this disorganized thing and you've got to set up and no one's listening. And, you know, it's killing what you're trying to do, but it's also kind of burning off a lot of the unnecessary stuff because you're reaching reality of what the audience is like, you know, and a lot of people, it's a hard knock life, irrespectively. You know, like I used to feel a bit jealous of people with normal careers. You know, you get paid every week, you can switch off at 5, but we, you know, we have something more and something less than that at the same time. So in terms of that barrier, you know, where we can access decent theatres and the dressing room and things like that, the results are going to be better. And that's not going to be a disabled music. And I really like that, Joe, that distinction you made, because we're talking about we can create music. You know, you go back and you look what poetry is all about. It's about flowers made into words. You know, flourishing is about floss. You know, the purpose of floss in that context is to cover the stench of death that is pervasive. We live carrying death within us as an inevitability. Once we appreciate the death, we can actually live much freer. We enjoy it, you know, because you kind of don't fear it the same, and you realize we are literally all in it together, and it's not morbid. And previous generations have been, you know, more open to that. And when you look at the sort of freewheeling archetype of the musician, what it depends on is accommodation and hospitality, because the people who spread the tunes and they disseminated the tunes without the internet had a different role in society than they had now. They were venerated. The buskers who went to Paris in the 50s and worked the cinema queues, the people in Paris, their culture had a sense of the value of that musician. They knew that musical making, with your tips or whatever, was about respect and support, because without it, it's not going to happen, as opposed to begging. You know, as opposed to I'm down on the luck. So I think it's important that there is a you know, an accommodation for all types of difference, all kinds of difficulties, but where that difficulty has been overcome in some creative way or some elegant solution to a complicated problem, well, that's overcoming disability. But, you know, to overcome it, you have to have it and be acknowledged. And there is a lot of an unacknowledged disability that society is disabling people by excessive control around at the moment. You know, like there's a lot of people who could do a lot more in their careers, were they not beholden to somebody 20 years older than them who's lacking inspiration, but is holding the checkbook. Now, you know, this at the moment, we're getting to this thing whereby we're going to want to gather, you know, and celebrate together. My hope is that there's going to be a change in the nature of ownership of community assets, which means that we see these large buildings as worthy of protection, not just purely because of architecture, but because of what the function of architecture is to do, which is to basically promote and show the triumph of human ingenuity against adversity. And that is what our cultural epoch is about. And actually, when you look back across the course of history, nobody's really interested in the bourgeois eras. You know, it doesn't create particularly nice art. You know, you look back at the Spice Girls, the consumerism, it's not aged very well. You know, and it was all underpinned actually by some people who took things a little bit seriously in the background and, you know, didn't fit in, but didn't want to fit in, and then nearly fitted in, and then it got too much, and then they had a break. And sometimes just separating what you want to do creatively from where you want to be physically, or where you want to be in terms of your career, can be the best thing to do. I mean, my experience was this. I had ambition. I ran as much as I could, you know, from I studied economics at Cambridge, then changed over to English literature, then got a music manager, struggled away, did jobs, supported the music career, but it was a little bit ego driven. And I recognized with a big health crisis, it was actually a bout of encephalitis, that I had had basically burnt myself out, and there wasn't that much that left to do when I was just chasing my own talent and ambition. So I then started to manage other artists, and I managed artists who had the sort of difficulties that we will all be sensitive and aware of. And in so doing, it took me about 4 or 5 years actually to realize what my issues were, because you cover them a lot. It's not rewarded in society often to be out and loud and proud about your difficulties if they are not immediately obvious. So then, having had a break from that, I obviously took on a lot of stress then from that work, and then returned to my own production, and then did bits and pieces. And of late, I had a break from music entirely, and I set up a nutritional a health food company. So we make kombucha, and I've worked with my wife, and I've applied what we did in music to food. And I've noticed even more barriers in the food industry, because to sell to a supermarket and they've not even heard of your product, and it's £500 million product in America, and they just don't care. I spoke to the buyer at Stagecoach, on the trains, and I said, look, you've got this probiotic drink, it will help people on the long journeys, digestion. All people want is a Kit Kat and a cup of tea, he told me. So, but I have a lot better in the food. And the thing is, now I've come back to music, a lot of the things are, you leave things sometimes unsatisfactorily in music, and you go, oh, maybe that person wasn't that keen on how it worked out, whether they're happy or not. And actually, I've revisited loads of people that, unfinished business, and everyone was pleased to hear from me. And we're all working together again. And, what unlocked that was a £10,000 stabilisation grant from the Arts Council because of COVID. And I'm creating something now, and I've got an album ready. And it's not just an album that exists on the computer with no mistakes. I can sit down at the start of the album and play it and end it in 45 minutes without sitting there in chronic pain. There's a couple of other things, you can, the over dependence on pharmaceutical resorts, look to nutrition. I am actually, there's a lot to be learned for certain conditions from legal medicinal cannabis, big opportunity there. It will be getting easier for musicians. So yeah, there's a lot there to discuss, and I really look forward to hearing from all the attendees. But my message is, it's kind of, you have to really now be clear about what you want to do and what your value is and who you want to reach and why you want to reach them. And it's about you, but it's also about them. And it's also about us. And if you get all that stuff together, and that's the problem, if you get that so that you get that feeling through notes and music and imagery, and, people are going to like it and they're going to respond to it. Is that 10 minutes, Lloyd? I can go on exponentially.
It's more than 10 minutes, and I wish we had half an hour, because there's so much to talk about in there. Thank you so much, Mark. We'll leave it there for now. I really like what you're saying about, it's like you're taking a wider view thanks to your experience in industries away from music, and also your experiences in working with other artists and managing other artists and running a record label. You've got a really interesting perspective on that. I think the theme that seems to be coming up is that idea of gatekeepers and those people who do have power and influence through the labels they run, the management companies they run, etc., etc. So we'll return to some of that, I'm sure, in the Q&A and the broader discussion later. Before we break, I'd love to just give Gareth another opportunity to pick up from where he left off. Gareth, is your mic working? Is your mic working? Let's give it another go.
I don't know. Is my mic working? Right. I can't remember what I said, and I apologize for what wasn't heard, which I fear may have been all of it, but I don't think we've got time for me to do everything again. But I think I was around about here. So I think I was talking, and it relates to some extent to what Mark was saying about structural things and also to design. Just to reiterate, my background really is an orchestral musician. I played the oboe professionally before a stroke redirected my path to composition. So a lot of my personal experiences come from places like opera houses, concert halls, and that sort of thing. And I was talking as a solo musician now, when I go through space as a composer, I don't feel so much that I'm well aware of my personal disabilities post-stroke, and I have physical, sensory, and cognitive impairments. But within those, on my day-to-day life, I'm fairly comfortable with the way I bump into things and lean on things and do or don't fall over certain obstacles. But in concert halls, This gives my appearance a really rather unusual thing, and has led me to me being asked to leave venues because I presumed a troublemaker or not there for professional business and that sort of thing. And as such, I feel like I'm more disabled by society than disabled myself. I feel like it's barriers in society which get in the way of me doing things to some extent. And one of these, especially in venues and public buildings generally, is the provision of disabled facilities, which are not suitable and are applied in a really rather sort of token way, in a sort of one size fits all capacity. You know, somebody who's lived in an electric wheelchair, in a manual wheelchair being pushed, and latterly bumbling around independently. The same disabled bathroom is not suitable for all these needs, and invariably it's got 4 broken high chairs in it anyway. So, excuse me. So I think those are personal issues I've encountered. Related to that, as I mentioned, hinted at, I think box office staff, front of house staff, and hospitality staff are not always well versed in how to deal with disabled customers. And as I said, have led to me being mistakenly accused of being there for non-professional reasons, which is embarrassing, inappropriate, and just a bit rude. The venues themselves are troublesome on the inside. You know, as a composer, it's part of standard practice to go on stage to take a bow at the end of the piece, but this is not rehearsed, and because the stage isn't considered a public space, all too often in my experience, the couple of often quite steep or narrow steps onto the stage from the auditorium do not have rails, and it's a poorly lit place with a lot of people to fall over in front of. So falling on and off stage is something I would care to not repeat anywhere. Thank you, Festival Hall. And the access relates obviously to the inside the auditorium for audiences more generally as well. And it's my experience that sometimes ushers, I know a lot of ushers because I do it myself, work voluntarily because they like the arts and are giving up their time. But I feel like if you're on a certain door, you should probably know whether there are banisters on the stairs in that part of the hall, for example. So I think that's an issue, right? So I'm trying to remember what I said earlier and what I didn't, because I've got to have it just sort of talking and keeping going.
No, Gareth, first of all, we can hear you really loudly and clearly now. And I think what you're saying, I mean, those 2 sobering examples of what you were saying about, you know, being dismissed from venues because of, you know, just a complete lack of, well, actually, to be honest, you know, just human empathy, but also a lack of training and awareness around dealing with customers with, you know, additional needs or with disabilities that you know, the ushers or the organization hasn't kind of got to grips with. I wonder if there's anything you have to say just before we wrap up for a short break around your experiences in academia and higher education, and particularly you're lecturing at Cardiff University, and you've done a lot of you know, beyond your playing career, you've sort of moved into more composing and more you know, teaching music. Any sort of reflections on that to end?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Lloyd. Yes, I mean, I think some of my experiences are paralleled in some respects, because music colleges, conservatories, especially some of the London conservatories, are quite old buildings and are not easily navigated. As I say, well, you know, I can think of buildings, I can think of one in Cardiff and one in London where the lift, for example, doesn't go to all the floors, but some of the teaching rooms are on those floors. This can be a challenge, especially in buildings that have historic, possibly listed staircases that you're told they cannot alter and cannot add rails to.
And of course, the sense of these institutions tend to be older, grander. You know, they've been running for 200 odd years or whatever, and it's the way they've always done things. And I suppose that's a particular challenge we talked about this before, Gareth, and we like in classical music in particular, like this sense of you know, kind of protecting the legacy of the music, or kind of buffing, you know, kind of the music that we've heard time and time and time before in the same format, in the same concert hall with the same musicians, most of them, you know, middle-aged or senior kind of white men, to be frank, you know, who hold that power and that privilege, which is slowly changing. And I think there's some interesting issues you raised and that Joe definitely raised earlier around like intersectionality as well, that I'd love to come back to. If it's all right, I'm going to pause for a break because I think we all need a break from Zoom, but thank you all for those kind of amazing provocations. And it's now over to, well, it will be over to everyone in the attendance room. We can't see you at the moment, but I'm hoping on the other side of this break, we'll get to meet some of you and hear from some of you and to hear your perspectives on what you've heard from our panelists. But let's take a short break. Thank you all very much. And we'll start again at around 5 o'clock. Thanks, everyone.
You're from there. Thank you.
Yo.
Wow.
Friendly faces popping up now. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi there. It's funny. Before, just I don't know if you guys know, as our audience, we couldn't see you when we were conducting that conversation. So it's a very odd experience where we know that there are people out in the ether listening to us, but we can't feel your handsome, nodding, smiling faces. So welcome.
Yeah, well, I've been extremely busy today.
Who's that? We've got Timothy.
Hello.
Hello, Timothy. Are you a musician yourself?
Yes, I am a musician myself. I'm a musician. I'm a, how can I put it? Well, I like making homemade instruments from everyday objects. That's what I do, as well as my own 2 albums that I'm working on. So I've composed a 30-track album. It's called Game Station Tunes. It's on SoundCloud, and it's all composed off the old Commodore 64, which is an old computer back in the 1980s. Yeah.
Amazing, man. The Commodore 64, Power Orchestra, actually, we did a project around video game music at the Barbican a couple of years ago. And one of my favorite tracks was the kind of I don't know if it was the intro, I've never played the console itself, but like the intro music to the Commodore 64 was really...
Yeah, but you see, there's an actual website called OddSynths, and what they do, they listen to all the old hardware back in the day, and I've got an account with them, obviously, and they've made plugins, VST plugins, that you can actually manipulate the sound from the Commodore and make different sounds. So it's like a synthesizer, but a Commodore version. And you can change the sound and do crazy effects. So I use their plugins to make my album, basically. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you.
I plan to get this released probably in the new year if I can, and hope to put it on Bandicamp and sell it. 30 tracks in total.
Well, very good luck with that. And I noticed that you put a question in the Q&A earlier.
Yeah.
I'll just read it out for anyone who hasn't seen it, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's fine.
How do you get yourself out there if you've just started out in the music industry? And what are the best steps to promote yourself when starting out? And Gareth gave an answer: send lots of emails, examples of work, etc. Be patient and stick at it, I'd say. I wonder if Joe and Mark, like, you might like to reflect on that question, maybe sort of your own experience about, you know, when you first started out in music, or how you got into the music industry and what you're doing today.
I started doing things in an orchestra when I was about 11. So and I always did music with other people, actually. And then when I became physically disabled, when I was 21, because I lost the use of my, it was about 23 when I lost the use of my hand. I had some time off, and then I went back to college. And so I was in an environment with other musicians. I think now is very different from then, and I kind of feel that has to be acknowledged in music. But I think that it would be great for you to get in touch with PRS Foundation and see what they can offer you, and also Sound of Music.
Okay.
And also I was Academy. These are organisations that are out there and they want to help young musicians like yourself, actually.
Okay.
And TCAF.
Mhm.
And TCAF, yes, of course.
and Disability Arts Wales, you know, and if you're in Scotland, Drake, is it Drake Music, Scotland?
Yeah.
But actually, don't marginalise yourself. Don't marginalise yourself. Just get out there. If you are interested in anything, just go for it. So any organisation that you see, and if you've got a business mind, set up your own business, like a sort. You know, if you're an entrepreneur, you know, start a label, have a Bandcamp, get on SoundCloud, do it for yourself, get on Resonance, get a radio program, do Resonance FM, all those things. The music industry is really interesting at the moment because it's full of little holes and yeah, which are there for you actually to get into. And I mean, I'm sure Mark will agree. You don't necessarily get a manager straight away.
Well, you see, what
but
I'm doing, you see, is basically I have my own business idea, right? I'm an inventor, and Pete, as well as a musician, I invent things, and I've come up with a way of using wastewater to power somebody's house for free, because we can't rely on gas, coal, and oil for the rest of our lives. It's going to end, and when it ends, everything will go. It'll be worse than the pandemic. It'll be worse than COVID. Imagine hospitals without any electricity. So, but for me to make this product and actually get it on the market, I need something to help me fund that. So this is why I've turned this to this bloody Jack Daniels instrument thing, because I can see that being a big hit on their side of things. Like, you know, I've got loads of these, absolutely loads. And yeah, I plan to make an instrument from these and see if Jack Daniels will sponsor me in an advert.
Don't get in touch with Graham Dunning. You know Graham Dunning. So he makes instruments, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you know, it's your thing. But if you make instruments, get in touch with people that make instruments. And Sarah Anglis. There are lots of people that are out there in music. So it's not just music. Music is so perforated. Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Thanks.
It's interesting. It's really interesting.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for your question, Timothy, and good luck with your business and your music making. There's a few more questions here from Mynir Roberts. As an organisation which plays a part in developing the next generation of young musicians, what should be our main considerations to ensure that disabled children have the same opportunity? Any reflections on that, either Joe or Mark or Gareth?
I would make sure. I would really make sure that if you should get behind UK music and get behind them about access. In fact, get behind them about all the organisations, all the music organisations, you know, and ensure that your disabled children have good access to get into, so they are able to access the music stages. They are able to have really, really, really good experiences of music, because you can only get so far sometimes in music as a disabled musician if you can't actually access a stage. You know, some people's music careers are just literally, they have to stop doing music, and that's not fair. That is absolutely not fair. So it's your responsibility as an organisation to really put some welly behind access. We are trying it now, but you've really got to get onto them about access.
there's lots of links going in the chat as well, which I think is brilliant. You know, Drake Music, obviously T Curve, DAC, Sound and Music, Help Musicians, PRS Foundation, Ivers Academy. You know, all of these organisations are now, you know, what we used to call the mainstream of music, and organisations, you know, representing singer-songwriters and composers and musicians. They are also becoming more aware and diversifying the opportunities they have in funding musicians and composers. So I would also echo what's been said already. Can I turn to another question in the Q&A from before from Rian? I don't know if Rian's still in the conversation. Actually, I can't see her, but she asked, how did you find out? This is, I'm assuming, to the panelists. How did you find out about music when you were younger? Was there a clear pathway to music for you as a young person? Gareth, you answered that. I don't know if you want to just kind of repeat your answer.
Yeah, sure, Lloyd. Absolutely, yes. I think I started music in school. In primary school through a sort of music and movement television show, and I saw an instrument and decided I wanted to play it. And I was lucky I had supportive parents who were happy to find an instrumental teacher, and B, I was, in that regard, I think I was extremely fortunate that I spent my early years in rural Somerset near Wells Cathedral, which has a wonderful school attached to it with a really strong music focus.
And what's interesting about your story, Gareth, is that what you were talking about earlier, that you started out as a, for want of a better phrase, a traditional orchestral musician playing the oboe, as I understand it, a non-disabled person. And then later on in life, with the changes in your circumstances and with your moving towards more composing and creating music, did you almost see your own view of the music industry change at that point?
Yes, I did. You know, I remember quite clearly when I had my stroke, I was at the end of my undergraduate degree at Guildhall, and I remember being in hospital and working with all these therapists, you know, and I was 20 years old. My focus was very much on learning to walk again, although that took years and years, really, to be able to do it reliably, to the extent I do it at all. But I remember the chat around the hospital was, oh, you'll never work again. And, you know, just saying, it was always the end. And if it hadn't been for a very supportive professor of composition, who'd been one of my teachers and who knew me from playing in contemporary music groups, who said, you know, why don't you think about composition instead, you know? And the conservator were extremely supportive, and I moved almost with just presumed matched grades from a degree in oboe to a degree in composition, and came out as a composer and was fortunate to do quite well in that first year, and got a scholarship for postgraduate study, which took me to Cardiff, and that somehow has turned into a job of sorts, and I'm still there 20 odd years later. But no, it's really Rian Samuel's fault, or thanks to Rian, I should say, before she comes around and gives me a clip.
Thanks, Gareth. And Mark, your own sort of pathway into music in your younger years, or like, I'd like to hear from you, because obviously Gareth and I particularly had that kind of more conventional classical training, and Joe to a degree as well. But Mark, you presumably were going out on the circuit and doing kind of gigs from place to place, or how did it work for you?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. I think going back to that thing, whether it's a child disabled or not, the thing that's most important for the child is the joy that they can recognize in joyful music. So I was lucky to have a vinyl player around, and I had a cassette recorder. And, you know, from the age of 4, I was listening to John Lennon Double Fantasy and getting through the Yoko Ono stuff as well, you know, and I'd play it and I'd rewind it. So for me, my hobby was always tape, and I had a guitar around that I didn't know how to play. And it wasn't really an instrument, you know, and then, yeah, gradually more listening as a younger person, really, like quite widely listening to nothing particularly. It was just what was there. And because there was a limited number of records, say 40 or 50, I would listen to them all. And then my leisure was going to the library and then getting vinyls out, like Wings records and things like that. And then by the time I got you know, I did music at school, so I did the singing in choirs, as in the Stockport choir. But I always forget what I've done sometimes. So when I got my Tascam 4-track, I've always been a bit strange. So I sort of started writing songs on that and layering them, so I get the 4 layers. And I've never really been able to translate what I see in a written score into perform music. It's just a particular weakness. And then later on, I sort of lost the desire. And I dip in and out of that occasionally. And actually, I sent out when I was about 13 or 14 all these cassettes to record labels. I'd always be fascinated about these London addresses. And then when I finished university, I got this thing called Showcase International book, which was basically the yellow pages of the music industry. And I thought I wanted a manager. And I'd made an album. So at that point, it was quite rare to have an album because I paid for it myself, cost a couple of grand. I used a student loan, did it in my final year. And that came back with a positive thumbs up. So I ended up with a manager who managed producers. So then I was able to learn about producing, which is, you know, the layering. And then I think the last time I ever sent out a demo was after that had sort of come to a halt. And I just sent out these tracks I was quite proud of to labels. And of course, I didn't get anything back because the industry had died because no one was buying CDs. So I think once you get to that point of, I mean, Gareth, I don't know if this is fair, when your doctor said that you'll never work again, it also means that you'll never really need to work again in the same way. So that can free you up creatively as well to do.
Yes, that could have been fair. Yes, I think, and for a long time, you know, I was fortunate straight out of music college that actually I was disabled to the point that I didn't really have to work, you know, and I depended fully for a number of years on the benefit system. You know, now I don't do that at all anymore. I feel like without that, I don't know whether my outcome would have been the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's the perfect use of the benefit system as a safety net, isn't it? Because and obviously for the last 10 years, disabled musicians, and this is the thing I was talking about with a wider disadvantage, you've been denigrated if you've needed to have that extra support. And all I was trying to say is if you can access to work support, that benefit system actually is quite generous if you genuinely want to get back and work and overcome difficulty. And it's just the fact that that's there. It's not easy to access, but it's probably worth doing. The difficulty is that you still get is when you identify within needing that type of support, you feel low about yourself, and that compromises the joy. Because you've got to transform the joy. So for me, that was always Beach Boys music, Simon and Garfunkel, you know, Pet Sounds. And that's not about rock and roll music, you know, that's about producers and orchestras and arrangement and, you know, vision. So that's like William Blake to me. It's all in the same line, be it C.S. Lewis or spirituality or anything. So trying to access that, I see music as being there and I want to hook into it. And yeah, if you've got health problems, sometimes you need it more because music and singing is good for you, you know, it's good for your lungs.
Mark, thank you. I think we have the text back on, and thank you to Sarah Beer as well for doing an heroic job typing that last part of the conversation. Thank you, really appreciate it. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm just going to throw open the conversation to anybody else still on the call who would like to ask anything, reflect on anything in the last 10 minutes.
Can I ask something? I feel a bit cheeky when it's someone who's helped organise the event, but I'm really want to pick up on the question where you all mentioned about disabling factors and society's disabling factors, but one of you said that you feel the social model has not been adopted by the music sector and that it's the last sector to actually do that. Can we have some ideas as to why that's the case? Why is that not really being embedded in things? I mean, I do know with some of the work I've done in the past, a lot of people have been involved in music as a career. As they start to acquire impairments, they often don't tell people because they're afraid they're going to be penalised, particularly around issues of hearing, deafness gain, that sort of thing. It'd be great to hear your thoughts.
I think actually that's right. That I'd like to follow on from you, Ruth. I think that's right. People don't admit to being disabled, and I kind of pointed to that in my talk when I was saying that music is extraordinary, and it's thought of as something extraordinary and magical, which it is, and extraordinary magical things are not made traditionally in music by disabled, impaired people. That doesn't fit the optical illusion that the music industry wants to create, or in the past has wanted to create. And it's been very, very, very difficult, I think, for music to move. It is changing because we have massive things, you know, like people like the Para Orchestra and huge, yeah, Beethoven and Handel, but they are magical and mystical, and their deafness, Beethoven's deafness is kind of, I mean, it's written into the myth of being deaf, but no one else in music is allowed to be deaf. No, he is yeah, and
Joe, I'm sorry.
I hate that phrase. I hate the phrase of, yeah.
Could you just repeat the last bit of your sentence again? You went a little bit.
The idea of overcoming things, people, the social model of disability, we need to work with people to address their composers. You sit down with them, you talk to them, you see what they need, what they don't want, what they do want, to provide a really, really good performance, good music. And in the past, it's all, I mean, it's very, music is very quick and fast, and it's to do with money, you know, time is money a lot of the time, and the social model doesn't quite fit. But COVID has changed things, I think, in respects to the way that people see human beings working in music, because all of us now, I think, are in the same, no, well, then we're not all in the same, but we've all experienced this idea of, you know, absolute loss and having to work with that, you know, and classical musicians having to work in performance spaces and just get on with it, you know. They haven't any choice, and it's really interesting to see how music's working now. World.
Mm-hmm. Joe.
Cultures, to see how disabled cultures work. So,
Joe, thank you for that. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm going to be slightly brutal and cut us off here because we are nearly out of time. The really good thing is that we have another talk this time next week. Admittedly, not with the three same panelists, but with 3 new panelists, including, I noted, Sarah Leanne Lewis, who's on this call. Hi, Sarah. So we'll hear more from you next week about your perspectives. Ben Lunn, who is a composer based in Scotland, I think. And I'm so sorry. Someone help me out. Who's the final panelist next week? I haven't got it in front of me. Troy, thank you. So sorry. Yeah, Troy from who organises Death Rave. So really, you know, 3 equally diverse and interesting panelists next week. Thank you, Deborah. And thank you, Deborah from TCARE and Ruth and the team from Disability Arts Cymru for organising this talk. Thank you to the captioners. Thank you all for coming and for engaging with us and asking the questions, and hopefully see you this time next week for maybe some more discussion on this topic. But in the meantime, just go well, and thank you. Could we all just show in our own way an appreciation, a hand of appreciation for our panelists for all of their time and work? Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Lloyd. That was great.
Thank you.